Okay, ladies and gentlemen, our final screencast for the vacation is going to focus on the Spanish-American War. So we're really going to kind of go through the causes of the Spanish-American War. You're going to have to try and figure out what you believe is the real reason that America is getting involved in the conflict. And then we're going to try and put it into the larger context of whether this is an imperialist action or just an intervention and not an imperialist action at all. So we're going to start with the causes of the Spanish-American War. So one of the things you first have to put into context is you have to remember that during the colonial time period, Spain controlled huge parts of the New World. Pretty much all of South America except for Brazil, large amounts of territory in the Caribbean, Mexico. So during like the early 1800s, as we talked about in class, they're going to slowly lose these colonies as they gain independence. And this is the era where America issues their Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine is going to play heavily into kind of what's going on here in Cuba, because the Spanish-American War is going to centralize around Cuba and the conflict in Cuba. Now, remember what the Monroe Doctrine said. It said no new colonies for Europeans. But it didn't say that Europeans couldn't retain the colonies that they already had. So Cuba happens to be a colony that the Spanish retain all the way up until the late 1890s. But there's conflict brewing and there's kind of an independence movement that starts to brew in the 1890s in Cuba. So what starts to happen is that throughout the 1890s, Cubans start to kind of gain steam with a revolution movement to get rid of the Spanish and kind of gain their independence. Now, the Spanish are not willing to just give up their colony of Cuba. And so really what's going to happen here is you're going to have an internal struggle between Cuban revolutionaries, the Spanish, the people who are staying loyal to Spanish in Cuba. So it's a story that's kind of played out over history many times. In the American Revolution, you have kind of the independence movement, people who remain loyal. Same thing in throughout South American revolutions. So really they're having a revolution. Now, why is this significant to Americans? The first thing you have to understand is Cuba is only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So it's close. It's a very close country. So what happens there, Americans really have kind of an eye on it. And Cuba's going to come up again in American history when the Cuban Missile Crisis happens. So it's so close to America that whatever happens there is kind of of vital importance to national security and to America in general. So the Cuban Revolution is kind of underway, and you have Americans on various different sides of the conflict. So there are certain Americans who are calling for America to enter on the behalf of the Cubans. There are Americans who say to kind of stay out of the conflict, that it's not our conflict. But by the late 1890s, you start to have different voices out there, kind of calling for Americans to get involved. Now, during this time period, a term you want to be aware of is something called yellow journalism. So some of the loudest voices in America, for America to kind of get involved in the conflict and who are covering the Cuban Revolution and kind of the war between Cuba or the Cuban people, the Cuban revolutionaries, and the Spanish government, are these people that are going to be known as yellow journalists. Okay, so where the term actually comes from, there was this cartoon character called the Yellow Kid that appeared in, actually two newspapers of the day, the New York World and the New York Journal, and they were kind of copying each other with this character, and so that's where the term comes from. That's not what the term actually means, though. Is yellow journalism is sensationalized journalism, kind of taking a story and expanding the facts, I guess, to put it nicely. Sometimes completely inventing the facts when you don't know what's going on, but really kind of expanding the facts and kind of building stories out of things that, maybe there's some facts in the story, but they really kind of like blow it out of proportion. So the closest thing that I could kind of give to you that I would think relate to yellow journalism of the 1890s would be kind of like tabloid newspapers of today. Or things that kind of just take stories and they they turn them into huge, events that really necessarily aren't these big events. So what's really happening here is you have a guy named William Randolph Hearst and a guy named Joseph Pulitzer, and they own two different newspapers, the New York World and the New York Journal. Now, these are competitive newspapers in New York City. So what's really happening here is they're trying to outsell each other. Okay, so each one, they're newspaper competitors, and they're trying to outsell one another. Now, the Cuban Revolution is a great story. So what they're doing is they're kind of pulling headlines and kind of, capturing the attention of the American public with really kind of sensationalized journalism, things to try and really sell people on it. So it's kind of like the 1890s version of like cable news, where they kind of make everything a huge story and kind of say that everything is breaking news. And the American people start to get really enraptured in what's happening in Cuba. Now, are there some real horrific events happening during the Cuban Revolution? Yeah, absolutely. So when you take a look at some of the things that actually are happening, well, first of all, one of the things that the yellow journalists do is they invent the headline. So believe it or not, before kind of these newspapers, there was no really such thing as like that huge front page headline that we're so accustomed to now. They did it to try and sell papers. And so this kind of becomes popular after them, but it's really centered around the Spanish-American War and selling papers. Now, what are some of the real tragic events that are actually happening in Cuba? Well, what was going on in Cuba is they had these things called reconcentration camps. Now, what the Spanish were doing is when they were capturing Cuban revolutionaries, they were putting them in these camps called reconcentration camps. And essentially, these places became, just awful dens of starvation and disease and just horrific conditions. So the New York World and the New York Journal are reporting these things and reporting what's going on in these reconcentration camps. So there are awful human rights violations happening in Cuba during the Cuban Revolution. And so there are real stories here, but what's going on is that the New York World and New York Journal are kind of taking these stories and then expanding upon them. Are the Spanish actively trying to massacre or commit a genocide against the Cubans? No. What they're trying to do is they're trying to take revolutionaries out of the general population. They're trying to stop this revolution by any means necessary. But these yellow journalists are really kind of taking these stories and turning them into what looks and appears to be a mass genocide. It's really kind of more of a situation of awful conditions for prisoners of war. Now, they're also kind of blowing other stories out of proportion, that the Spanish are like stopping American ships and they're searching American sailors and they're searching American women and doing all these horrific things to try and like build up this momentum for war. Now, you have to ask yourself, why would these yellow journalists want war? Well, war sells papers. Great stories sell papers. So they are kind of trying to pressure the public. Now, there's lots of critics of yellow journalism that are going to kind of come out there and say that this is not, really the case, or this is not America's war. Now, it's just that their voices are not quite as loud as the voices kind of calling for war. Now, some events are going to accelerate this. So, from the human rights standpoint, you have things going on. You have people interested in the Cuban Revolution because they see America's struggle in what the Cuban revolutionaries are trying to do, trying to throw off a colonial power. But some other events are really going to kind of accelerate America's belief that they should get involved in the conflict. So a tragedy is going to happen known as the sinking of the Maine. The USS Maine is an American warship that was stationed off the coast of Cuba in Havana Harbor. Now, what happens is that it gets sunk in 1898. Now, so when the USS Maine is sunk outside of Havana Harbor, the press kind of takes it and just runs wild with it. And they, of course, are going to blame the Spanish, as the Spanish have, torpedoed the Maine and sunk the Maine, kind of as an act of war. Now, in reality, nobody knows at the time really what happened. It could have been a mechanical malfunction. It could have been the Spanish who blew up the ship because they didn't want Americans near Cuba during this conflict. It could have been a lot of things that caused the Maine to sink. Now, we know 115 years later, they actually found the remains of the Maine at the bottom of Havana Harbor, and they did all kinds of testing on it. And what they actually found out is that it was a mechanical malfunction that blew up the Maine. So the Spanish did not sink the Maine at all. But that's irrelevant. In 1998, that's completely irrelevant because the press is kind of taking this and saying that without any evidence that the Spanish sunk the Maine, people are outraged, people are angry about it. They're putting all kinds of pressure on our president of the time, who was President McKinley, to kind of urge him to declare war. And, all these papers are kind of covering this story and really kind of saying it's been torpedoed, it's been bombed, it's the Spanish who are behind it. And so you have people in Congress who are calling for war. Now, most of your, remember we learned the term war hawk. So you can use this term often when we have people within Congress who are calling for war. So the first time that we used this term was in the War of 1812. When you had a lot of Democratic Republican congressmen like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun who were calling for war against the British. In this time period, you're going to have some people kind of calling for war again. Now remember, when we talked in our previous screencast, most of the people who are kind of pro-expansion are Republicans. And so you're also going to have most of the pressure on President McKinley to declare war are mostly going to come from Republican senators and Republican congressmen and House of Representatives members. So they're putting pressure on the president that this is an insult to our national character, that the Maine has been sunk. We can't stand by and watch this take place. And so they put a lot of pressure on McKinley to try and get him to basically advocate for war. Now, Americans are kind of weary of this. Within that, you have this balance within American society. I remember when we talked about in class that Americans are kind of always a little uneasy about being involved in imperialism. So eventually, Congress is able to get enough support to decide to intervene in Cuba and to declare war on Spain. Now, it's not just the sinking of the Maine. It's a number of different factors that go into it that we've talked about, previously, as far as the human rights violations, seeing themselves in the Cuban revolutionaries. But I think the sinking of the Maine is kind of like the tipping point to getting Americans involved in it. And so Congress eventually is going to declare war. Now, very interestingly enough, this shows kind of their uneasiness with imperialism, is in the War Declaration, they're going to add an amendment to the War Declaration called the Teller Amendment. So this is an important amendment. And what it says is that basically it disallows the annexation of Cuba completely by America. So what it's trying to lay out in the Declaration of War is that America has no imperialist intentions. That we're going to fight this war, we're trying to help the Cuban revolutionaries, we're trying to defend America's honor, maybe enforce, it depends on how you interpret it, enforce aspects of the Monroe Doctrine, but we are not and have no intention of annexing Cuba in this process. So we're not looking to kind of become the imperialist power over the Cuban people. We're trying to help them gain their independence. So this is interesting that America kind of adds this in. So you can see that Americans are having this internal struggle between imperialists and anti-imperialists within the government. And even people who are pro getting involved in Cuba, that doesn't mean they're necessarily pro-imperialism. They're pro-intervention in this case. Doesn't mean that they're pro-imperialism. So it's an important addition. All right, so what I'm going to ask you guys to do is to kind of interpret some of these different historians' views of why we got involved in the Cuban Revolution and why we fought the Spanish-American War. So what I gave you is the chronology, the facts, things that were actually going on, the yellow journalism, the reconcentration camps, the sympathy with the Cuban revolutionaries, the sinking of the Maine. Those are facts that were going on. These are kind of broader, like, historical theses. of different reasons for why America might have gotten involved. So I'm going to ask you guys, your activity is going to be to kind of like dissect these and kind of like pull these apart. Now, when you look at the Spanish-American War itself, it is largely a naval war. We're just going to kind of briefly go through the war. It is largely a naval war, and so Mahan and Mahanism does prove to be correct. So we win a bunch of battles. It's fought not only in Cuba, but also fought in the Spanish Empire and the Philippines and other places around the Spanish Empire. Teddy Roosevelt actually used his post in the government to go create a unit called the Rough Riders. And he goes down there and, he fights in some famous battles, but in kind of typical Teddy Roosevelt fashion, he overemphasizes his greatness, overemphasizes his role in the battles, and he writes these glowing accounts of his unit's, situation during the Battle of San Juan Hill, and kind of, I guess, overemphasizes his role a bit. But he does gain some fame from the Spanish-American War, and it definitely helps him when he becomes the president. Now, important for us, we're just going to talk about this and mention it briefly because we're going to discuss this in a lot of detail when we get back to school. So we at the end of the Spanish-American War, we're going to sign what's known as the Treaty of Paris. And the Treaty of Paris is an interesting development. So Cuba gains its independence from the Treaty of Paris, but America also gains some territory. Okay, we're going to gain Puerto Rico. We're going to gain Guam over here, and we're going to gain the Philippine Islands. So this is kind of an interesting development. If you look at what's happening, when you look at it through this map, you really see what's happening in America or what's happening to our expansion and our influence. What we're really doing, so first of all, we gain Puerto Rico, we gain Guam, we gain the Philippines. So as a result, these were all Spanish territories, but by gaining this land, we kind of de facto become an imperialist power through gaining it. We don't gain Cuba, but there's going to be some, some interesting drawbacks or some interesting points that kind of go along with our not annexing Cuba. Well, I like this map because if you look at this map, it really shows what's happening. You see what's going on in the Pacific and you see what's going on in the Caribbean. America is kind of expanding. And remember we talked about those secretaries of state like Seward and James G. Blaine who wanted to make the Pacific an American, they call it like an American Ocean. Really by this time we're gaining these small little islands, and what these islands do is it kind of gives America a ton of influence as far as across the Pacific Ocean. It's not a lot of land, but we're basically controlling ocean when you look at this. So it's an interesting development, and we're really going to kind of dive into this in deep detail in class on Monday and Tuesday when we come back. But for now, what you guys are going to focus on in your activity is really dissecting the causes of the Spanish-American War. The effects we'll cover in class. Really, you guys got to focus on what are some of the major causes and dissect those historians' interpretations of the causes.